There is a moment, and most people cannot name it precisely, when you sit inside a room full of people who know your name and you feel absolutely nothing. Not sadness, not anger, just a quiet, unsettling distance. Like watching a film you have already seen, like speaking words your mouth knows by memory while your mind has already moved somewhere else entirely. You look around at the same faces, hear the same laughter, follow the same rhythms, and somewhere beneath the surface, a voice you cannot silence anymore whispers, "Something has shifted. Something inside you has moved." And the terrifying part, the part no one prepares you for, is that what shifted was not them. It was you. And once that realization settles into your bones, you cannot unfeel it. You cannot return to who you were before you understood it. This video is for the person who already knows this feeling, the person who has been trying to explain it to themselves in silence. Because what is happening to you is not a breakdown, it is not loneliness, it is not arrogance. It is something Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to articulate, and once you understand it, nothing about human behavior will ever look the same again. Carl Jung wrote that psychological growth is painful precisely because it separates you from the unconscious comfort of the collective. Most people never recognize this process while it is actively unfolding around them. They simply register loneliness and assume something is fundamentally broken within themselves. But sometimes, loneliness is not a punishment. Sometimes it is evidence. Evidence that your consciousness has begun traveling somewhere your former environment simply cannot reach. And people sense this shift long before you ever articulate it in words. Human beings are profoundly tribal by nature. Every group operates through invisible agreements. Stay predictable, stay emotionally similar, do not expand too far beyond the psychological level the group has collectively settled into. The moment you begin changing internally, friction appears, not because you became aggressive, not because you developed arrogance, but because your very presence quietly unsettles the emotional equilibrium around you. People do not resent your weakness. They resent the quiet possibility that you might move beyond them. That is why certain friendships begin feeling strange the moment you become more disciplined, the moment you become quieter, the moment you stop broadcasting every private thought, the moment you stop reaching for constant external reassurance. Your evolution forces the people around you to face their own stillness, and most people will choose the mirror that flatters them over the one that reveals them. The response rarely arrives directly. It moves through subtlety first. The sarcasm intensifies. The genuine encouragement disappears. Your ambitions become labeled as unrealistic. Your personal limits become labeled as attitude. Your silence becomes labeled as ego. But what genuinely changed was never your character, only your perception. And perception is quietly dangerous inside social environments built on collective unconsciousness. You begin noticing patterns you once moved through without awareness. How certain individuals only reach out during moments when they need emotional relief. How some connections survive entirely through mutual self-destruction. How entire social circles are secretly held together by shared complaining, gossip, or unexamined insecurity. The unsettling realization that arrives next is this: many of the relationships surrounding you were never actually built on understanding. They were constructed on psychological convenience. As long as you performed your assigned function, the system felt stable. Drop 111. I am awakening to who I was always meant to be in the comments right now. The therapist, the entertaining one, the agreeable presence, the rescuer, the emotionally reliable listener. These were never identities you consciously selected. They were roles quietly assigned to you, and you accepted them because belonging felt more essential than authenticity. But the moment you stop performing that assigned identity, people respond as though you violated a contract, because in a deeper sense, you did. You violated the silent agreement they had formed with the earlier version of you. And this is where Carl Jung's concept of individuation becomes essential to understand. Individuation is the psychological process of becoming who you genuinely are beneath layers of social conditioning, inherited masks, and collective expectations. Jung considered it the most important task a human being could undertake. But individuation carries a brutal dimension that almost nobody discusses openly. It isolates you, not always in a physical sense, but psychologically. You begin experiencing a kind of emotional homelessness inside spaces that once felt like belonging. The conversations begin feeling repetitive. The energy around familiar people starts feeling heavier. You observe how deliberately most people avoid genuine self-awareness, and suddenly something uncomfortable becomes clear. Most social bonds are sustained by mutual unconsciousness. The moment one person begins waking up, the connection starts fracturing. Slowly, without announcement, without resolution. At first, you attempt to preserve the relationships. This is what makes this particular stage so psychologically exhausting. You explain yourself with greater patience. You reduce your own expansion to avoid making others uncomfortable. You pretend to still find stimulation in things that no longer reach you emotionally. But something inside begins feeling dishonest. Not dishonest toward them, dishonest toward yourself. Because once awareness genuinely expands, forcing yourself to contract creates a specific kind of internal friction that compounds over time. Your psyche begins splitting into two competing versions: the person you are actively becoming and the person others still insist on seeing. That sustained tension quietly depletes your energy in ways that are difficult to trace. This is precisely why many people feel strangely exhausted around their oldest social circles without being able to identify the source. It is not always toxicity. Sometimes it is simply the fatigue of sustaining an identity that has already expired. You can feel it in quiet, specific moments. You share a thought that genuinely matters to you, and the room responds with silence or deflection. You speak about intentionality, purpose, or solitude, and the people around you immediately convert it into humor. You disengage from gossip, and suddenly you receive fewer invitations. not because anyone consciously decided to exclude you, because human beings instinctively distance themselves from whatever quietly disrupts the emotional agreements of the group. Most people will always choose the comfort of familiarity over the discomfort of transformation. And this awareness becomes darker when you begin recognizing how many relationships function through invisible emotional dependency. Certain individuals do not value your presence. They value access to your energy, your reassurance, your attention, your emotional labor, your reliability as a psychological constant. The moment you stop providing those things automatically, the behavior shifts with a speed that is genuinely disturbing. Suddenly, you are described as cold. Suddenly, you are different. Suddenly, you changed. But what they are actually expressing is that you stopped being psychologically available in the same way they had grown accustomed to. Most connections do not dissolve when respect disappears. They dissolve when awareness arrives. If this is resonating with you, share this video with one person who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Carl Jung Philosophy so this work continues reaching the people it was meant to find. Jung understood that every human being carries a shadow, the concealed dimension of the psyche filled with suppressed impulses, unresolved insecurity, envy, resentment, and fear. Most people invest their entire lives in pretending the shadow does not exist. But growth activates it, particularly in others. Your discipline confronts someone else with their own lack of it. Your self-respect holds a mirror to someone else's self-abandonment. Your ambition reawakens the dreams another person quietly buried years before they met you. And rather than confronting that discomfort internally, many people unconsciously redirect it outward. They criticize, they mock, they create distance. They find indirect methods of undermining your confidence. Not because you caused them harm, because your evolution became a psychological trigger for everything they have refused to face within themselves. This is why developing genuine psychological strength often feels socially dangerous. The more defined your identity becomes, the less manageable you are to others. And control exists inside far more relationships than most people are prepared to acknowledge. Some families sustain control through guilt. Some friendships sustain control through emotional dependency. Some social groups sustain control through ridicule and quiet shame. The moment you stop responding to those mechanisms, the entire dynamic begins destabilizing. And that destabilization makes people deeply uncomfortable, especially when your stillness alone exposes what their words were designed to conceal. Drop 444. I trust my own becoming, even when others cannot. In the comments below. There is a particular calmness that develops in a person after emotional exhaustion has permanently reshaped them. They stop arguing. They stop over-explaining. They stop investing effort into convincing others to comprehend something that comprehension cannot be forced into. because they have finally arrived at a realization that restructures everything. Understanding cannot be manufactured, and that realization permanently alters the way you experience human interaction. You begin noticing how infrequently people genuinely listen, how most conversations are quiet negotiations for validation rather than authentic exchanges of thought. How many individuals enter relationships not seeking real connection, but seeking an escape from their own interior. The unsettling element is that society consistently rewards this unconsciousness. People who maintain constant external distraction integrate more effortlessly into social structures. People who never examine inherited norms appear more relatable. People who avoid self-awareness often build larger social networks. Because depth is inherently disruptive, and disruption has always unsettled crowds, there arrives a specific moment when the anger dissolves. And that moment is the most psychologically significant because anger still contains hope. Hope that certain people might eventually come to understand. Hope that older connections might recover what they once held. Hope that loyalty instinctively survives psychological evolution. But eventually, something quieter and far more permanent takes the place of that hope. Clarity. You begin observing human behavior without the softening layer of romantic interpretation. You notice how many people construct their personalities around social survival rather than personal truth. How effortlessly moral conviction bends beneath the pressure of group acceptance. How rapidly genuine admiration converts to resentment the moment someone begins expanding beyond the group's emotional comfort zone. And then, one by one, the illusions of childhood begin dissolving. You realize that maturity was never determined by age. Many adults are simply older versions of children operating with more socially sophisticated coping strategies. Some escape through endless entertainment, some through the constant presence of other people, some through substances, some through relentless noise. Very few sit in genuine stillness long enough to encounter themselves honestly. That is why solitude frightens most people at a level that feels almost primal. Silence strips away distraction, and distraction is the primary defense most people have constructed against self-confrontation. When the external noise disappears, unresolved emotional material rises to the surface. Envy, regret, insecurity, emptiness, fear. The shadow begins emerging, and most people immediately seek stimulation to suppress it, because they cannot yet bear what lives underneath. But if you remain in that stillness long enough, something fundamental begins shifting. You stop requiring constant approval. You stop performing emotional versions of yourself designed to maintain connection. You stop pursuing inclusion from people who secretly feel threatened by your development. And gradually, another understanding emerges. Not every person was designed to accompany your entire journey. Some people were only compatible with earlier versions of who you were. That does not make them destructive, but it does make the connection temporary. This is among the most difficult truths psychological evolution delivers. Growth naturally generates separation, not because you become superior, but because your inner landscape changes frequency. The things that once provided satisfaction no longer reach the same place within you. The conversations that once felt meaningful begin feeling circular. Certain environments begin carrying an emotional weight that your nervous system no longer recognizes as home. And this creates guilt, particularly if empathy is central to your nature. You begin interrogating yourself. Am I becoming arrogant? Am I retreating too deeply into isolation? Why does genuine connection feel increasingly rare? But growth frequently resembles arrogance to individuals whose only reference for belonging is sameness. There is a profound difference between becoming emotionally unavailable and becoming emotionally intentional. One originates from ego, the other originates from awareness. And awareness permanently recalibrates your tolerance. You begin recognizing manipulative patterns almost the moment they appear. The acquaintance who contacts you exclusively during personal crises. The person who conceals envy inside humor. The group that quietly punishes individuality through collective mockery. The connection sustained entirely by guilt and obligation. Once these patterns become visible, the capacity to unsee them disappears. That is the cost of awareness. It permanently dissolves the comforting illusions that once made certain relationships feel safe. People frequently claim to desire truth, but truth reorganizes relationships. Truth reveals power structures concealed beneath social courtesy. Truth exposes the transactional nature of interactions most people prefer to experience as genuine. Truth requires you to acknowledge that certain people valued the version of you that could be directed. And the darker recognition beneath all of this is that many people preferred the earlier you not because you were more fulfilled, but because you were more manageable, more susceptible to influence, more emotionally dependent on their presence. The moment you begin constructing an identity that no longer requires external validation as its foundation, social resistance materializes almost automatically. Because psychologically autonomous people resist manipulation. And nothing destabilizes insecure individuals more profoundly than someone who no longer requires permission to inhabit themselves fully. That quality reminds others of the interior constraints they have never confronted, so they redirect their discomfort toward the person who made those constraints visible. What makes this transformation particularly disorienting is that it almost never feels dramatic while it is occurring. There is no definitive confrontation, no final argument, no identifiable moment when everything simultaneously collapses. It unfolds in complete quiet. You gradually stop initiating contact. Certain exchanges begin requiring effort they previously never demanded. You spend more time in your own company and begin noticing that the silence feels more honest than performance ever did. And then, one day, something strikes you with unexpected force. Peace has replaced the compulsive need for stimulation. That recognition changes your entire relationship with connection. Because most people have deeply conflated emotional intensity with genuine closeness. They have come to believe that relationships must perpetually generate excitement, validation, drama, or emotional turbulence in order to feel real. But intensity can become addictive, particularly for people whose early environments required emotional adaptability as a survival mechanism. Some individuals were conditioned from childhood to earn affection through usefulness. Others learned to navigate existence by becoming accommodating. Some developed hyper-awareness of others' emotional states because unpredictability once carried real consequences. Over time, these survival mechanisms calcify into identity. The caretaker, the mediator, the emotionally available one. But eventually, the psyche reaches a point of exhaustion from sustaining roles that were never organically its own. And that exhaustion generates a question that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. If you stop performing for others, who remains? Drop 999. I release the version of me that needed their approval to feel whole in the comments right now. Most people never confront this honestly because their entire sense of self has been constructed through external reactions. Compliments become the currency of self-worth. Attention becomes evidence of existence. Social belonging becomes a form of moral validation. But the moment you psychologically separate from the compulsive need for external affirmation, something profoundly uncomfortable begins happening. You start perceiving society with different eyes. You observe how extensively human behavior is governed by fear of exclusion. How frequently people override their own instincts to preserve social acceptance. How many individuals remain completely silent in rooms where they privately disagree with nearly everything being said. Not because they lack conviction, but because rejection activates something ancient and deeply biological within them. Thousands of years ago, exclusion from the collective meant death. That instinct has not been erased from modern human psychology. It simply expresses itself differently now. It is why people tolerate disrespect to avoid isolation, why they diminish themselves to protect relationships that do not honor them, why they laugh at things that do not reach them, why they apologize for qualities that unsettle others. Most people are not living authentically. They are continuously negotiating psychological survival. And the moment you stop participating in that negotiation in the same way, your presence begins disturbing people without any deliberate action on your part. Your stillness becomes threatening. Your limits become interpreted as coldness. Your self-possession becomes labeled as ego. People grow profoundly unsettled around individuals who no longer operate through unconscious approval seeking, because emotionally autonomous people cannot be redirected through shame with the same ease. This is why certain connections grow colder after genuine healing occurs. The wounded version of you was more accessible to subtle influence. People who carry unresolved trauma frequently tolerate dynamics that psychologically healthier individuals immediately recognize and decline. And many social structures depend on exactly that tolerance to maintain themselves. Consider carefully how consistently groups normalize dysfunction, chronic gossip, quiet disrespect, Emotional inconsistency. Surface-level support disguised as loyalty. Competitive friendships performing as genuine care. Once perception sharpens to a certain degree, the concealed antagonism beneath social pleasantries becomes impossible to ignore. Not everyone celebrating your ambition genuinely wants to witness its fulfillment. Some people find your unrealized potential comfortable because potential still contained is non-threatening. Actual transformation demands comparison, and comparison awakens the insecurity most people have spent years carefully burying. This is why certain individuals withdraw the moment your life genuinely shifts, not materially, but psychologically. Authentic confidence unsettles insecure people in ways that failure never could. Failure is familiar territory. Confidence introduces a quiet hierarchy, and hierarchy silently governs nearly every human interaction, whether or not anyone admits it openly. The deeply uncomfortable reality is that many relationships maintain their apparent stability only because everyone involved has silently agreed to remain emotionally predictable. The moment one person moves beyond that structure, the shared illusion begins dissolving. Not dramatically, but with just enough quiet tension for everyone present to feel it without naming it. Eventually, you stop grieving the specific people. You begin grieving the illusion. The illusion that everyone who entered your life was intended to remain. The illusion that loyalty automatically persists through psychological transformation. The illusion that shared history guarantees continued emotional alignment. It does not. Time spent alongside someone does not automatically create depth. Sometimes it creates only familiarity, and familiarity can disguise fundamental incompatibility for years, even decades. This is why some people remain surrounded by constant social presence, yet experience a profound and persistent sense of invisibility. Their connections are built on routine rather than genuine resonance. They speak every single day while revealing nothing real about themselves. They share laughter while internally feeling completely unseen. Most people fear isolation so intensely that they accept surface-level connection as a substitute for actual understanding. But shallow connection gradually suffocates self-awareness. You begin editing your own thoughts before you speak them. You reduce your ambitions to dimensions others find non-threatening. You conceal your evolution, not because growth has slowed, but because you have learned that certain environments impose quiet penalties on authenticity. And the penalties are rarely stated openly. They arrive through accumulated social signals: dismissal, mockery, emotional withdrawal, passive resistance to your expansion. Human beings are extraordinarily efficient at enforcing conformity without ever directly discussing it. Jung understood this at a fundamental level. He believed the collective mind applies continuous pressure on individuals to remain psychologically dormant, because genuine individuality threatens social predictability. A person who has developed full self-awareness becomes resistant to simple categorization, and society deeply prefers categories. The obedient one, the wounded one, the devoted follower, the entertainer, the reliable provider. Once others identify your function, they understand how to interact with you emotionally. But when you develop beyond the role they have assigned, genuine confusion appears, and confusion converts rapidly into discomfort. That discomfort is precisely why some people invest considerable effort in returning you to who you previously were the moment they detect you changing. Not always consciously. Sometimes they simply miss the version of you that required less from them, the earlier version that absorbed more without responding, that remained quiet when silence was easier than honesty, that prioritized others' comfort over its own clarity. Growth fundamentally disrupts all of that. You begin registering energy beneath words, intention beneath appearance, patterns beneath individual promises. And this entirely restructures how you experience every relationship. A manipulative compliment becomes transparent almost immediately. A rehearsed apology sounds exactly like what it is. Forced enthusiasm becomes visible through its own inconsistency. Performative affection reveals itself through the moments when consistency disappears. Awareness sharpens perception in ways that are simultaneously clarifying and deeply painful. Because once you truly see people with undistorted vision, sustaining comfortable illusions demands more energy than you have left to offer. And still, the hardest confrontation of all is not with others. It is with yourself. Because somewhere within this transformation, you recognize your own participation in the illusion. You dismissed clear warning signs to avoid the discomfort of loneliness. You absorbed emotional imbalance because being needed provided a sense of purpose. You overrode your own instincts repeatedly to protect connections that were not protecting you in return. That recognition carries genuine weight, not because it generates shame, but because it demands accountability. The shadow does not only exist in others, it lives within you as well. Your fear of genuine abandonment, your reliance on external validation as a measure of your own worth, your unconscious tendency to mistake emotional intensity for authentic love, your inclination to remain in familiar pain rather than face the uncertainty of unfamiliar freedom. Most people dedicate their lives to observing others while remaining fundamental strangers to their own interior. But genuine self-awareness is uncompromising. It dismantles comforting personal narratives one by one, and eventually you arrive at an understanding that permanently alters your perception of human nature itself. Many people are not connected to each other through truth. They are connected through shared avoidance of truth, through mutual distraction, through collective performance, through emotional dependency that neither party is prepared to examine. This is why genuine authenticity feels so rare in the world. Authentic people disrupt social illusions through their mere existence. They create an involuntary confrontation with the gap between who others are and who others are performing to be. And most people will choose to defend the performance rather than face what the mirror actually reveals. Because the performance is socially celebrated, the mirror is psychologically costly. After sufficient disappointment has passed through you and left its permanent mark, something inside quiets, not into coldness, but into precision. You stop anticipating emotional depth from people whose survival depends on remaining at the surface. You stop justifying your limits to individuals whose entire orientation requires misunderstanding them. You stop pursuing reciprocity from those whose understanding of relationship is inseparable from personal utility. And in that quieting, life becomes unexpectedly clearer. Loneliness transforms its texture during this stage. What once registered as abandonment begins feeling gradually and genuinely like protection. Because once perception has been sufficiently sharpened, you begin understanding how psychologically costly proximity to unconscious people can be. Not in ways that leave visible marks, but in the slow, cumulative depletion that comes from being in constant contact with unexamined chaos. People who have not developed genuine self-awareness frequently project their internal disorder onto everyone surrounding them, while experiencing themselves as the consistent, reasonable party. They generate confusion and experience it as passion. They practice control and experience it as care. They perform manipulation and call it love. And the most disorienting part of all is that many of them believe their own construction of events completely. Human beings are extraordinarily skilled at constructing the self-narratives that protect them from painful recognition. Jung believed the ego builds elaborate internal stories precisely to insulate itself from truths that would require it to change. Few people genuinely want complete honesty about who they are. They want the portion of truth that leaves their self-image undamaged, which is exactly why genuine accountability is so infrequent, and why people who hold others accountable are so frequently experienced as threats rather than allies. This is why misunderstood people gradually become quieter. Not because they have exhausted what they have to offer, but because they have recognized that most people do not listen to understand. They listen to locate confirmation for what they have already decided. And that recognition permanently restructures the way you communicate. You become selective with what you share and with whom you share it. You observe far more than you speak, not from superiority, but from the deep pattern recognition that extended awareness eventually produces. The more developed your consciousness becomes, the more clearly you understand that energy transfers occur constantly between people. Some individuals consistently leave you feeling expanded, clarified, more fully yourself. Others leave you fragmented, depleted, subtly diminished without any identifiable cause. Your nervous system registers these truths before your conscious reasoning catches up to them. That unexplained weight you carry after time with certain people, that is often psychological misalignment your body recognized long before your mind found language for it. The constant low-grade tension around someone who presents as entirely reasonable, that is frequently suppressed instinct that knows something your conscious mind has not yet allowed itself to name. You cannot continue expanding while remaining fully anchored to environments that are fundamentally committed to your older identity. At some point, psychological growth requires space. Not isolation as a permanent destination, but separation from the continuous unconscious influence of environments that cannot accommodate who you are becoming. Every genuine evolution of identity involves loss. Loss of familiarity, loss of comfort, loss of the sense of belonging that required you to remain unchanged. But also, and this is the part that takes longest to recognize, the loss of illusion. And illusion is extraordinarily expensive. It costs authenticity. It costs self-respect. It costs the interior quiet that only arrives when you stop performing and simply exist. Most people continue paying that cost indefinitely because the prospect of standing genuinely alone feels unbearable to contemplate. But there is something more unbearable than real solitude. Becoming unrecognizable to yourself in order to remain recognizable to people who never truly saw you to begin with. The most frightening truth at the center of all of this is that outgrowing people is not fundamentally about them. It is about the dissolution of the version of you that once required their presence to feel complete. It is about quiet, permanent death of the self that needed external permission to exist. And once that version of you releases its hold, once you stop negotiating your own awareness in exchange for someone else's comfort, something opens that no amount of belonging could have given you. You stop being a reflection of every room you enter. You stop adjusting your frequency to make others more comfortable with their own stillness. You begin, perhaps for the first time, to take up the space that was always yours. Not loudly, not with announcement, but with the kind of quiet, unshakable presence that only becomes possible when a person has finally stopped being afraid of who they find when the performance ends. Carl Jung called this individuation. He called it the most courageous act available to a human being. And he was right. Because the world will consistently, persistently, in ways both subtle and direct, invite you to remain asleep. The invitation arrives through relationships, through belonging, through the warm and familiar comfort of being understood by people who knew you before you knew yourself. But you have already felt what waits on the other side of that invitation. That quiet, unsettling, unmistakable sense that something within you has already moved, and that no matter how far you reach back, you can never again fully return to unconsciousness. That is not your wound. That is your liberation.